episode of the webinar series on methodologies for greenhouse gas baselines and monitoring in the transport sector. Today's webinar looks at vehicle efficiency improvement programs. And I'm very glad to be your moderator today. Before we start with the actual presentations, I would like to give a short introduction into the webinar tool. What you see in front of you is the control panel, and you can change the language in the top globe icon if need be, and also under number 3 you see that you can put the webinar on full screen, but most important is the questions pane for you. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of our 2 presentations. And any question you would like to ask, please just type them into the questions pane and then press the send button. We will pick them up as we go along. And also, if you have questions during the presentations already, just type them in, we collect them, and then we come back to the questions in the end. Everybody is muted in order to avoid any disruptions. So please just type in whatever you'd like to know at any time. Our agenda looks like this. We have around 90 minutes at most, with an introduction to the webinar series and the compendium. I'll do that, give you a little bit of background on how and why this was developed. And then William Agyemang-Bonsu from the UNFCCC Secretariat will give an introduction on chapter 3 and the main aspects of MRV when it comes to vehicle efficiency improvements. Second, we'll have a presentation by Manpreet Singh from KPMG India on the E-BRT methodology that was applied in Sri Lanka, which was a UNDP project there, and we'll hear more about his practical experience in the second half. And then we'll have a joint Q&A session at the end. So our speakers, first, William, he's a manager within the Mitigation and Data Analysis Program of the UNFCCC Secretariat and manages a team of technical experts providing assistance to developing countries in the areas of preparation and implementation of mitigation actions, as well as supporting countries in the development of transparency and MRV frameworks. Manpreet, is a director at advisory services of KPMG and has been working in the field. May I ask the other presenters to not click on the presentation, please? So Manpreet has been working in the field of environment, climate change, and sustainability for the last 13 years. He has advised a large number of clients in government, multilateral, and private space, assisting them in better understanding sorry, we have a short technical issue I'll take care of now. Just a second, please. So here we are back again. So sorry, so Manpreet works at KPMG India and has been assisting stakeholders in understanding complex and evolving policy, regulatory, and business environment risks and opportunities in relation to sustainability. So I'm your moderator today. My name is Urda Eichhorst. I work as an advisor on transport and climate change for GIZ. And my current focus of work is on supporting NDC implementation, so the implementation of nationally determined contributions, in other words, climate targets of countries in the transport sector. And this includes capacity development, both on mitigation actions themselves, but also on monitoring and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions of transport activities. So when we talk about the compendium on greenhouse gas baselines and monitoring, I would like to give a little background on how this was developed. And the passenger and freight transport volume was developed by GIZ in cooperation with the UNFCCC Secretariat and lead authored by Charles Kushian from the Center of Clean Air Policy. The whole compendium consists of different volumes, and all of them are multi-stakeholder efforts. And the main idea behind this was to actually summarize and give guidance to the wealth of existing methodologies on greenhouse gas baselines and monitoring that already exists. And the idea of the compendium actually came up already quite a few years ago when we still had a lot of discussion on NAMAs, so-called nationally appropriate mitigation actions. And for many people, for many countries also, the challenge of the requirement of NAMAs to also always quantify the emission reductions of the measures that were being taken led to this idea of providing a publication that actually provides guidance to the wealth of existing methodologies that are out there, so that it's not an argument against doing a mitigation action, because also the benefits had to be quantified, because it often seems, especially to the policymakers who are not usually working on emissions quantification, as really a big challenge and a lot of work. So sometimes it's also used as an argument not to even look into it. So this was the idea of providing this knowledge in a concise format. So the transport volume includes 8 chapters on different mitigation action types that you can see here. And today we look at chapter 3 on vehicle efficiency improvement programs. This is a little bit of a closer look at chapter 3, and you can see when you look at it, it really is a step-by-step guidance through the process of developing, setting up baselines and how to do it, and then also how to quantify the mitigation scenario. So the first chapter, and the chapters look the same in each of the categories. So always looks at the mitigation action in itself, and then chapter 2 looks at structure of mitigation effects. And William will go into this in more detail for the vehicle efficiency improvement program, so I will not go into all the details now. But the cause impact chain, just let me say that we developed this, or used actually this idea of the cause impact chain that was already developed in the greenhouse gas protocol as a useful tool when you start thinking about a mitigation action on what are actually the effects of the action I'm looking at, and what are the main indicators to monitor those effects. So we also use this in the transport volume. And then, of course, determining the baseline and calculating emission reductions is always the third section in each chapter. And then section 4 provides guidance on the selection of analysis tools for vehicle efficiency improvement programs. And this is really the core idea of the volume, to provide some guidance of when to use what sort of tool and which one could be appropriate for a particular intervention. And then in the end, you always get one example. In this case, we have an example on the Mexican freight NAMA that looked at truck scrapping, a truck scrapping scheme in Mexico. And with that, I would also already like to hand over to William for his presentation. And I'll just give the control back to him so he can.
Okay, thank you very much, Urda. I hope I'm clear from this end, and good morning to all participants. Like Urda said, I mean, we are all glad to be able to share with you this compendium on greenhouse gas baselines and monitoring. We would encourage you to be making reference to the compendium itself. It's already uploaded in the handouts, and we will encourage you to download, because what we'll be doing today is only to walk you through it, but it will be better applied if you spend time to read it and see the usefulness of it at a later stage. So just a quick description in terms of what the vehicular efficiency improvement program covers. We could have programs that will cover, depending on the scope of the program, national or regional or local programs that are looking at changing technologies that have been applied within the program in the context of the boundary which is set, or changing behavior. So there are two main things that we'll be looking at, either to change technology with a view to improve efficiency, or to change the behaviors with a view to also improve efficiency in fuel use. And a number of applications would then be useful. For example, if you look at subsidies and incentives that will lead to improvement in fuel efficiency, like low rolling resistant tires or anti-idle devices, or the scrapping example that we have in the compendium from Mexico is a good example of those type of programs that could be sort of classified as vehicle improvement programs. Let me emphasize from the outset that we are not discussing I would say efficiency standards and other aspects of improvement programs in this chapter. Certainly, there are certain other chapters in the compendium that cover these areas of particular interest, and we would refer you to those chapters as we go through the program this morning. And we just pick an example, what Ghana, for example, has shared in their national sustainable policy, which are looking at incentive for or disincentive to import overaged vehicles, providing, I would say, incentive for the import of new vehicles, which certainly would also improve in the use of fuels within the fleet. Sorry, I think I'm moving too quickly. Yeah, the cost chain impact or the cost impact chain is what Urda already has explained in terms of what we're trying to look at. It shows the key variables that need to be monitored and how these variables can be affected based on the improvement that we put in place. If you're looking at fuel efficiency, for example, we could be ending up, or important thing that we need to be monitoring to actually ensure that we are able to gather the data to justify the impact of the mitigation action. Would be, for example, looking at the number of vehicles and the types, for example, and also monitoring the fuel kilometer use that are in the fleet. It is important to also bear in mind that as we're looking at the direct impact of these interventions, we also have to be mindful that sometimes some of these interventions can also lead to what we refer to as a rebound effect, which is necessarily an unintended effect arising from the improvement interventions that we have in. And it can be positive or it can be negative, and we need to look at how we address that. What's also important is that we need to already caution you that there's a possibility of double counting, and which therefore you need to be aware if there are other programs within the country or within the boundary. I will try to explain what that means later. You need to be able to sort of account for the changes arising from other policies or actions that are also aiming at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the application of other policies or actions in different ways. So it's always very important to avoid that double counting in terms of when you are estimating your emission reduction arising because of the intervention that you've made. To start, I think it's always very important looking at your mitigation action within the vehicle improvement programs to be mindful of the boundary that you set in. You can have different types of boundaries. Certainly, geographical boundaries are very important in the sense that you'll be looking whether you are doing a national level activity or you're looking at the regional or even sub-regional or sub-national activities. And it's always very important to be able to actually lay out clearly what the coverage or the scope of activity is. But it's also important, even within the fleet itself, to be able to define, for example, what are we looking at? Are we looking at the whole gamut of vehicles fleet within the geographical boundary, or are we looking at specific technologies? For example, if we're looking at type of vehicles that are in the commercial or private taxis, or you're looking at freight transport within the fleet. And therefore, it's always very important to set the boundary at the beginning of your program. And it's also critical to also look at the temporal scale, where you are setting what time scales are we talking about. In the case of some technologies, for example, the use of electric vehicles, you might be mindful of the fact that there could be additional emissions arising because of upstream generation of power to sort of that leads to the production of this electric equipment, and therefore you need to account for that also in the design of your interventions. So moving on to how we determine the baseline, calculate the emission reductions that accrue because of the program, it's always important to set this baseline scenario for the fuel efficiency improvement programs at the start of the program, so at least you are able to clearly estimate how much emission reductions has happened because of the intervention. Baselines, as you know, normally are estimated by determining the total fuel use of each type of vehicle within the boundary, or by determining the kilometers traveled, the vehicle kilometers traveled by each vehicle type, and applying the appropriate emission factor to estimate those emissions. And we can use several approaches. We'll be talking here basically about 3 different approaches, which we have sort of elaborated a little bit more in the compendium itself. For projecting in terms of ex-ante estimate, or for looking at counterfactual projection, looking at ex-post, how the fuel use and transport activity for the baseline or fuel efficiency or the program scenarios are. You can rely on expert judgment, which is the first approach which we would want to use. And these are based on historical trends using time series and data gathered ideally over quite a good number of years. We talk about 10 years in this case. And this is actually based on, I would say, national level experience with experts providing that type of useful information on trends, and therefore be able to set the methods to use to measure the emission reductions. You could also look using the fleet turnover models that estimate the number of each type of vehicle per year, which means you have to be doing some annual evaluation of the turnover of vehicles and their types within the fleet. There is the third approach of using economic projections and elasticity models that project technology uptake based on their costs and benefits. In the compendium, we haven't elaborated very much on the third approach, but certainly the first 2 are what we are focused on, in particular the second one, where we have used a number of models, or we point you to a number of models that you can also use to do those estimations. So basically, what would the emissions be like? And I think it's very, very important that we're able to get that up when we're doing the project. It's really the project emissions, which is real or estimated ex ante, certainly minus the baseline. what's important is that we are looking at the project within a set of boundaries. For example, if you look at for bus fleet renewals and actual fleet classes are compared with the project baseline, you would have to estimate how much new vehicles are added to the fleet and how much is also retired from the fleet, and therefore be able to account for the emission reductions as a result of that particular intervention. If I move on to the fourth point that we want to make is more guidance to you in terms of what tools are out there that you can use to do these estimations. And maybe let me emphasize that we will not be able to go through all these number of tools, but at least we're pointing you to the fact that some of these tools exist out there, which can help you to do a number of they guide you in terms of trying to estimate. First, identify the actions that you could take in your country, and also to be able to estimate emissions or monitor the particular key indicators that is relevant for the estimation of the emissions associated with your intervention. And I think what is important is that you will be encouraged to go to the compendium itself and look at some of the tools that are available out there. Let me emphasize that many of these tools are really free, so you don't need to pay for them. But it's just a little effort to go looking for them from the internet and maybe talking to the developers if it becomes necessary to get access to those tools. And you need to look at how useful that tool or how appropriate that tool is to you at a country level, because it depends on definitely the amount of data that you have at the national level and the expertise in terms of use of a number of modeling tools that would help you to choose which one might be appropriate for your particular case. So it's very important that you look at the data requirement and therefore the level of aggregation, disaggregation that's required for you to actually use that tool to ensure that you have high accuracy in terms of your estimates of the emissions. So you see in the slide here just still further elaboration, and that's how we have presented them in the compendium. There's a table given in the compendium that gives sort of guide and illustration of the existing tools. Like I said, yes, look at them. And certainly what is for many developing countries, what is important is always also the cost associated with these tools. And you see that for most of these tools, is just free, and you can just go in and download and use as you see appropriate. The fourth aspect of, or the fifth aspect of this particular section of the compendium looks at monitoring in terms of what key indicators you need to track over time within the program or the project that you're implementing. And if you go to the table presented in the table 25 of the compendium, you have a number of key indicators that needs to be monitored over time for you to actually look at the fuel efficiency improvement that you are undertaking. What is important is that it tries to give you in terms of which category that indicator fits. If it's linked with implementation, then certainly you will need to track these key indicators in the context of the project implementation, or as the project is being implemented. You need to have clearly what is important is to need to have the level of that particular indicator, which is certainly the baseline before the project, and also we need to monitor it over time as you are doing the implementation. There are some performance indicators, for example, the total vehicle kilometer traveled, which you need to also monitor, and this you need to monitor annually to actually be able to indicate how the program or your project or your action is actually having effect. If you look at impact indicators like fuel usage, which could be as a result of the what we call the rebound effect, you could have that also monitored within the period 1 to 5 years. I mean, you could do it annually, but certainly a lot of these are quite expensive to do. But you can monitor them within that time frame to allow you to have enough data to actually demonstrate how much reduction is happening because of this intervention. Okay, I think that brings me to the end of the presentation. Very quick, but it's only to sort of give you the appetite what we have tried to describe in the whole section of the compendium, and encourage you to actually go look for the more information, read. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to take them. So I'll hand it over to Urda, and then maybe Manpreet will continue from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, William, for this presentation and giving us a little more insight into the chapter 3 of the transport volume. Without further ado, because I said we're going to take up the questions in the end, I would like to hand over to Manpreet from KPMG to provide us with one of the examples, one of the methodologies that are also mentioned in the transport volume. Maybe you've noticed at the end of the table that William just presented. And this is an example of electric bus rapid transit, which I think is really an interesting example, as many countries are looking into bus rapid transit developments at the moment, as well as electric mobility. So I'm very happy that Manpreet is here to share his experience from their project that was also done on behalf of the UN Development Program. Manpreet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Urda, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm in India, so here we are already into the afternoon, so that's why good afternoon as well. So this particular NAMA that we initiated in Sri Lanka, and of course under the able leadership of Alexandra Switzer from UNDP, who had chosen us, to help with development of this initiative in Sri Lanka. It is important for me to give you a bit of a background about how we really shortlisted this intervention, because it is thus very important before we look at the actual methodology that we followed to go about the project. So when we reached out to various stakeholders within the Transport Ministry of Sri Lankan government, we tried to look at some of the existing projects that were being planned within the transport sector. We also wanted to study some of the important mitigation related interventions that could be planned in the country of Sri Lanka. Just 1 second, I'm trying to move my slide, but it is Urda, are you able to move the slide, please? Thank you.
Yes, let me just move it for you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I've already moved it.
Right. So this is the content of the presentation today. So I'll just spend a bit more time in terms of looking at the need for this sustainable transport in Sri Lanka and why we actually chose the E-BRT NAMA. I will also touch upon some of the intricacies like what were the financing requirements, when was the implementation plan being envisaged, how did we go about estimating the emission reductions from the NAMA, and also I'll touch upon some bit of aspects around the MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification framework. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Urda. And the next, please. Yeah, so if you look at this slide and if you look at the transport sector in Sri Lanka, a large part of the emissions from the country is actually from the transport sector. That is 49% of the emissions, if you see, were contributed by the transportation sector to the GHG inventory of the country, which made us to obviously believe that this sector was one of the important sectors if one has to look at emission reductions from the country in the future. Within the transport sector, we looked at which are the sources which are contributing the most to the emissions, and we realized that it was actually the road-based transport, which was the primary reason for the high emissions from this sector. Even within the road transport sector, we felt that a large part of the population was dependent on, the public mode. So it was actually a mix of public and private, but it was largely through buses. So these were more or less the private buses that were being operated in a more unorganized manner. Yet, uh, the organization wanted it to be more organized. So the transport ministry wanted to have some sort of an intervention to go with looking at reducing emissions, and also maybe looking at what could be more sustainable modes of transport that can substitute some of these unorganized private buses which were operating in the city of Colombo. Now, why we chose Colombo was, of course, because of the fact that Sri Lanka is not a very big country, but a large part of the population, if you see, is residing within the capital, and the capital is also, if I can say, expanding day by day. So it was important for us to initially, first of all, look at what could be done within the national capital, and then also look at applying and maybe scaling up this intervention to other cities within Sri Lanka. So if you can go on to the next slide, please, Urda. Yeah, so within the Colombo metropolitan area, we came across the plan which was already under consideration with some of the donors as well as the Ministry of Transport and the Colombia Municipal Corporation on looking at a bus rapid transit project on the Gal Road. So Gal Road, if you're not aware of how Sri Lanka and in particular Colombo is, Gal Road is one of the most busiest roads, which is at a stretch alongside the sea within the city. And this particular BRT was being envisaged to come over and substitute the road mode at this Gal Road. Um, Now, so while there were obviously considerations on how the funding of the BRT itself could come up, we thought it was more apparent for us to look at interventions within the BRT and not look at funding the entire BRT through a NAMA-based intervention. So it's just the reason why we were thinking on how to best utilize a project which could result in additional, sustainable mobility solution than just looking at, infrastructure development in the form of BRT. So we obviously thought that we will look at BRT. However, we will not look at funding the BRT through international climate finance because, uh, we've seen that there are not enough funding available for funding large infrastructure projects, but it's largely some additional, activities or projects that could, ideally be substituted and be funded through, a funding maybe through the NAMA. And this is the reason why we chose that on the stretch of the BRT, can we look at electric buses, instead of the planned diesel-based buses, within the larger BRT plan. So this is the reason why we thought, it could be beneficial if we can look at a specialized system wherein only electric buses be allowed on the BRT. And you will see that we have made certain conservative assumptions within the NAMA to be able to, substitute that. Um, Now I should come to the actual NAMA intervention. It was designed that we should look at introducing electric buses into the BRT, as I've already said. There needed to be provisions for incentives for adoption of electric vehicles, which is why the government thought that within the plan, we could look at introducing tax breaks for importing electric vehicles. Now, it is obviously essential for us to look at whether or not Sri Lanka, being a small country, should actually look at developing capacities on manufacturing on their own. So, wherein we decided that it doesn't make sense to have such an infrastructure created, but it is obviously beneficial if they could look at importing these buses from outside. And which is where we looked at the government of Sri Lanka to actually support and bring in certain incentives um, which could help with introducing that. We've also looked at building capacity, through various activities for, electric charging stations, as well as looking at electric buses. We've also looked at, installing and upgrading certain institutional frameworks, for electric buses. So, while there were already presence of hybrid vehicles within Sri Lanka, this NAMA was in particular looking at introducing electric buses for the first time in the country. That is the reason why it was more important for us to look at, associated infrastructure of building capacity, as well as introducing institutional reforms. The output that we envisaged from the NAMA was, of course, to look at increased adoption of electric vehicles, increased adoption of public modes of transportation by introducing BRT and looking at cleaner modes of transport, reduction in GHG emissions, of course, reduction in traffic congestion and pollution. And this was, one of our major observations, that there was huge traffic congestions in the city and associated pollution because of one, the vehicles that were being used were old and were not, maintained properly. There were a lot of black smoke, and people were really feeling bad health conditions because of these buses. We also envisaged that there could be development of new job markets because of whole electric infrastructure that was being brought through the NAMA. Another outcome that we envisaged was a modal shift from private to public transport. Again, as I said, most of the buses which were operating were private buses. So we were looking at the government now introducing through a PPP mode, more accountability within the system, within the public system, to operate and maintain these buses. Also looking at increased access to sustainable low emission mode of transportation, increase the low emission development strategy mainstream in the governments. This was a larger outcome that was envisaged through the NAMA. In terms of strategic impact, we wanted to look at increased energy security through reduced dependence on imported fossil fuels as well, and increase in economic savings. So another aspect to note here is that a lot of the imports of oil are happening in this country. This was again one of the motivations to look at how do you substitute some of the oil imports as well. So while we've not estimated how much that could be, but we definitely thought that we could bring in this aspects on reduction in oil imports as well. The transformative change that was being targeted was to shift to low emission development pathway in the transport sector within the country, which was largely dominated till now by fossil fuel buses. Let me come on to the specifics. We were looking at within the BRT intervention, the average length of the tip, and I think these were quite a conservative assumptions that we had made, because we didn't want to look at expanding the emission reduction per se, but we wanted to look at what is more feasible as well. So while we could have assumed that there could be larger trips or larger distances, but we went with some of the assumptions that were made in the original BRT infrastructure plan, and we sticked to that to say that the average length of the trip could be 10 kilometers. The average kilometer per bus per month would be around 20,000 kilometers. Total kilometer per bus per year was envisaged to be about 233 kilometers. The average number of trips per day per bus per day was assumed to be 20. The composition of existing bus fleet being replaced was again sourced from the BRT detailed project report, as well as looking at what were the actual buses which were running on the roads. What we wanted to introduce were electric two-door buses. The NAMA envisages an intervention to procure 100 of these electric buses. The NAMA duration is assumed to be around 10 years. If we could go on to the next slide. I think I've spoken about these objective and expected benefits already. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Urda. Yes. So what were these targeted impacts? If you look at the emission reductions per year, these were around 7,500, and these appear small because, yes, as I've been telling you, the assumptions were pretty conservative. If the distance increases of the buses and also the number of buses themselves, then this emission reductions could actually be much larger than we've envisaged here. So it will also, if we are able to get better buses as well, and if we could also substitute the electricity generation entirely through renewable, then I think one could look at even bigger benefits that could come through an intervention like this. So total emission reductions were close to approximately 75,000 within the 10-year period of the NAMA. We also looked at some of the other co-benefits or sustainable development co-benefits like air pollution reduction, where we looked at reduction of SOx emissions. We looked at increasing the frequency of electric buses along the BRT, the number of e-buses on the BRT itself, then the capacity building, cost savings from increased energy security per bus annually, some of the jobs created, and also looked at the number of private sector operators involved within the whole NAMA activity. If you could go on to the next slide, please. And the next. So I would just point out here that the emission reduction calculation was based on the AMS3C, the small scale methodology for introduction of e-buses. And if you look at this slide where we've looked at the proposed implementation plan of the NAMA, wherein we had established the NAMA institutional structure, and we had the pre-NAMA intervention implementation, secure international funding, and then look at the phase 1 and phase 2, which I'll just explain in my next slide. So if you could go into the next slide, please. Yeah, so here, if you see, we've envisaged 2 phases, and this was largely in consultation with the government, depending on how much support that the government was willing to make to the NAMA, and also the kind of funding that we could potentially secure through an international climate funding or a facility. The first phase looked at introducing 10 electric buses, and these would be by the Sri Lanka government bringing in a policy to exempt the import duty for these buses. And the international facility, maybe something like an NAMA facility, looking at funding or financing the initial 10 buses that could be brought in. Then we looked at the second phase, in which and this phase also involved the private sector owners. So if you see, initially the 100% of these first 10 buses were being funded through the international facility, and the private sectors were being brought in to first of all demonstrate that these buses would be successful in terms of meeting the requirements of the passengers as well as operating successfully. So the second phase brought in the government to actually introduce a reverse auction kind of a arrangement in which they invited private sector to also contribute, which means that we've assumed that a private sector party would ideally be agreeable to spend at least the amount of money that they would spend for a baseline bus, that is a diesel bus. So we've assumed that the private sector contribution could actually be at least for the diesel bus. The additional delta, which would mean the additional requirement of expenditure for going in for an e-bus, could then be contributed through the NAMA funding agency. So here again, if you see, we are assuming the government to come in by keeping the import duty intact for the second phase as well. We've brought in the private sector to fund at least the same amount of money that they would be willing to pay for a baseline bus, and the additional delta being brought in through the NAMA funding agency. So this was the whole plan of introducing the first 100 buses through this NAMA intervention in Sri Lanka. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So just a glimpse of the financial outlay for a complete 10-year period. The Sri Lanka government would be spending around about 1.3 million USD. The private sector would bring in 72 million, and the international climate finance could bring in about 30.19 million. And the distribution, of course, in the phase 1 and 2 was 10 million in the phase 1 and 93 in the phase 2. So next slide, please. So coming on to the methodology, I already stated that we've used AMS 3C because we thought that the emission reduction potential wasn't significant, at least for the first 100 buses. So it was falling under the type 3 of the small scale methodologies. The type of mitigation action, of course, displacement of more GHG intensive vehicles and introduction of new electric vehicles that displace the use of fossil vehicles in passenger and freight transportation. The baseline scenario was to continue with the operation of the diesel buses in Colombo. The emission calculation approach is, of course, based on the unit of service which is provided by the baseline project vehicles times the emission factor for each respective vehicle to provide the same unit of service. If you could go into the next slide, please. Yeah, so here you see that we've determined the emission factor for the baseline bus, which was about 1315 grams of CO2 per kilometer, and these have been estimated based on some of the assumptions that are listed in this slide, particularly on the mileage of the bus, the calculation of the specific fuel consumption of the baseline vehicle, the net calorific value of fossil fuel, and the default, of course, technology improvement factor for baseline vehicle for each year, which has been assumed through the methodology itself, and looking at the distance traveled, which is the unit of service. Moving on to the next slide, please. So here we have total emissions for the diesel baseline buses, and they were estimated to be around 30,000 tons of CO2 per year. If you can go on to the next slide, please. So the emission factor for the electric bus, we've again calculated through the specific electricity consumption using the CO2 emission factor of the electricity grid in Sri Lanka. And we've also looked at some of the transmission, the T&D losses for providing that much amount of electricity. So they've also been considered. And then the emission factor for electric bus has been arrived using the formula given in the methodology. Moving on to the next slide, please. So we see, we have estimated the emission factor. Then we've looked at the annual average distance traveled by the electric bus, and we've looked at some of the operating diesel-based baseline buses. So the emissions from an electric bus has also been estimated. So we've estimated the emissions from the baseline bus, then emissions associated with the grid and thereby the electric bus. If you move on to the next slide. Here we have thus the total emission reductions, which is the baseline emissions minus the project emissions, which are, as you see, around 7,500 tons of CO2 per year, translating to around 75,000 for the 10-year period. Let's go on to the next slide, please. And the next. So till now you've seen that our assumptions were pretty conservative. We've not tried to look at some of the associated emission reductions, which, if brought in, could actually potentially raise the emission reduction potential of the NAMA quite substantially. And these were some of the monitoring parameters which we have taken in, which needs to be done by the different stakeholders within the ministries. And here we have a measurement requirement, for example, for the average distance traveled, the specific electricity consumed, and also the CO2 emission factor of the electricity used by the project vehicle, and then the number of project vehicles under operation. So other one I've already explained, which was about more how to monitor the sustainable development co-benefits. If you move on to the next slide, please. So here we have a very short arrangement of MRV, and I think I would like you to refer to our report in detail, which is available on the UNDP website, and look at the details of the MRV arrangement. We've looked at how potentially the NAMA donor and the implementing entities collect data, report data, and then look at the verification of these data sets. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Urda. So I think that was my presentation on methodology, including financing details and the interventions of the NAMA, including the capacity to scale up the NAMA to other interventions, as well as looking at scaling it up across Sri Lanka and maybe move on to other Asian countries as well if the model gets successful. I'm happy to take any questions, in the question and answer round. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much, Manpreet. I think this was a very interesting presentation indeed, to see how an existing methodology actually out of the CDM methodologies was applied in a sort of new context. So I think this was very informative and interesting, and we have also already received quite a few questions on the same, as well as on the first presentation by William. So I would like to start with a question to William, actually, and this one reads, regarding the baseline estimation, is it acceptable to use only one of the three approaches that were developed? And I'll just go back to this slide, because they just bear with me for a moment. But William, maybe you can already answer to that question on whether it's possible to use just one out of these three options. William, you're still muted.
Yeah, I muted my microphone, so sorry. No, I mean, it depends on the rigor that one wants to use. Certainly, the expert judgment would have its own limitation, because you are just relying on what the person and his experience working in country or with the fleet will be telling you, and also depending on data, how much data is available to justify that. But I mean, we have not used, like I said in my presentation, we have not looked at the economic projections and elasticity models so much in this compendium, but certainly the fleet turnover one, that's the second approach, one that could sort of be easily applied. And I think that is what you are observing in the Sri Lankan example that has been presented by Manpreet, where, I mean, there's always the need then to actually monitor the number of vehicles in circulation over time, and also the type of vehicle that's being used. So that's what I would say. I don't know whether Urda, you want to add anything to that.
Thank you, William. No, I think that is exactly right. I mean, this is the whole idea of the different possible approaches, is that you have to choose the one that fits your context and your available data as well, of course. Moving on to the next question, we have a couple of questions on the Sri Lanka example. And the first one is on the job creation. How was the jobs created actually estimated?
Yeah. So yes. So there are associated things that we need to see here. So we have the BRT itself, which is generating jobs, which not, as I said, conferred the larger benefit of BRT and the modal shift that it's doing. But when we say the job creation, it was largely to develop the market for electric buses. And when we say market, we are clearly saying that we are not envisaging manufacturing happening within the country of various things, but at least we envisage that the jobs could be created, one, for maintenance of these kinds of buses, then secondly on battery and associated infrastructure that would also come in with these. So we will have people who will start selling batteries. We will start having models wherein the battery swapping could come in. So there could be service providers who will start charging, developing charging infrastructure, and you have to also take into account the fact that we are saying that these buses are private buses, and these are owned by private entities. However, we are also envisaging that the NAMA intervention or the NAMA donor could also be financing certain aspects of creating the infrastructure. So one, for the creation of the infrastructure of charging stations, we envisage there would be new jobs created. For the maintenance of electric buses and batteries, etc., there would be again some of the new jobs that will create. So even if you see the number, we're not saying that a large number of jobs are being created, but we are saying that because these buses would be a little different, so they would need different skills to maintain them and also sustain the larger infrastructure that is being created for electric buses, and not just electric buses. If the intervention succeeds, then it could lead potentially to also look at private vehicles in terms of cars or two or three wheelers also. Because one of the larger problems that we also saw in Sri Lanka was with respect to the three wheelers, and these were largely being used as a very, I don't know if it's preferred, but if I should say the word preferred, but it is being used by a lot of people in the country, and that was also creating a lot of mess because one, they were in large numbers, secondly, they were uncontrollable. So we were also envisaging the shift from that mode of transport to the electric buses. When you see the whole BRT resulting in rapid movement of buses across, which could potentially be preferred by these people who were using the three-wheeler as the mode of transport. So this, I would feel, largely brings in why we are saying there could be additional jobs created through the NAMI.
Okay, thank you very much, Manpreet, for that. I'd like to continue with one more question on the BRT example. And this one is on the buses themselves. And I'm very happy that we have this question, because this also was something that I wanted to ask. And this one reads, my impression of the person who asked the question was that the e-buses had half of the capacity of the fossil fuel by articulated buses in terms of passengers transported. And then there's a second question on the on the emissions saving in terms of tons of CO2 per passenger kilometer, whether those were looked at as well. But maybe first the question on the buses, whether they had the same capacity, because you're replacing 100 by 100 buses.
Yes, Urda. So we were envisaging that the capacity would actually be similar, and largely because of the fact that we've been repeating that we were targeting to have similar level of service being provided by the new buses also. So if you will recollect, I've mentioned this during my presentation as well, that we were targeting to have a similar level of service being brought by the new intervention. So which means that we were targeting that each bus being replaced would have a similar capacity as the baseline buses.
Okay, so the bus that is shown in your presentation, would that have actually been defined, or is this just an example of a bus?
That's an example, and I now see that it may be misleading.
Okay, good that we've clarified that, because yeah, on the photo, of course, this particular bus that is shown here looks smaller, but okay, so the same capacity bus is targeted.
Yeah, I mean, even the articulated buses that are shown in the picture are not there in Sri Lanka.
Okay,
yeah.
Good. Thanks for that clarification. I think this was an important one. Also, when we look at experience from other countries with electric buses, we sometimes see that I've worked in China before with GIZ, and there as well we've seen that Beijing, for instance, I think they've made this experience that it was hard to, or basically not a direct replacement, one bus for one electric bus, because they actually, the electric buses they had a smaller capacity, and also I think in the beginning, at least due to some maintenance issues and so on and so forth, I think the replacement rate was more something around 1 versus 1.5 electric buses. So these are some of the lessons from other countries that we are also interested in learning from.
Sure. I mean,
and there was this.
That's interesting, but because in Sri Lanka and Colombo in particular, if you see these buses, they were also smaller capacity buses only. So these were not very large buses. And largely being operated by the private sector. So these were not. Okay. As big as maybe shown in the picture.
Okay, understood. Then, did you also look at passenger kilometer emissions per passenger kilometer? But this is actually the same question. If it's the same capacity, then the reduction should be.
We haven't. So if you
relative to the passenger kilometers, well.
No, we haven't. So because we haven't really looked at the modal shift, and if you see, we haven't really estimated the emissions from the modal shift. So the activity is really just replacing the same mode of transport through a more efficient one. So which is the reason why, I mean, we're calculating absolute emission reductions and not really estimating the. I mean, we haven't estimated the per passenger CO2 reduction. Which could be one thing that we can look at. I mean, it's not difficult to do that, but we haven't done that in the now.
Okay, thanks. Then I'll have a more general question, and that reads: will the approaches for MRV at national level vary from MRV at project level? And this is, of course, a very general question. So maybe, William, you could take this one up. Is there a difference in MRV at the national level from the project level? And this is all it says. So
yeah, I don't think the methodology will be different, and it's just a matter of scale that we're talking about here. National level certainly would, and then that's the discussion we had on the project boundary. You might have to cover several other. Depending on the type of vehicle that you're looking at, several other, the type and the number that you need to look at, which will be more at the national level, but maybe less at the local level. So the challenge you have is a scale issue. How much sort of resources will be required to do it on a local scale as compared to a national scale, but the methods you are going to apply and the key indicators or key performance indicators you need to monitor will not change, whether it's small or large in terms of the geographical coverage.
Okay, thank you, William. Maybe I would like to just add that, of course, since the question was quite general, it's always the first question is, what exactly is your mitigation action? Does this, in this case, would a national replacement program of conventional buses by E-BRT, e-buses essentially, then of course what William said is correct. The data collection, of course, here we looked at the city level, so we have an average for this particular bus system. So essentially, the question is then whether you would like to look at each particular city and make a very detailed calculation, basically for each of the cities that apply it, also using the particular data on the bus kilometers that are being replaced with electric buses, and then finally, basically summing up each of the cities into a national total, or whether there's a more simple approach that would assume a sort of average VKT traveled by buses in the country that is then probably introducing more uncertainties in cities. In the larger cities, the distances are larger than in the smaller ones, but of course it's also possible. And making this point just to say that there's always different levels of data disaggregation possible. So when data is not readily available at the beginning, there's always an option to start with the data that you have and improve it over time. And of course, if there's not as detailed data available, for instance, for a national program, then you might want to start with averages, even though they introduce more uncertainty. And this is, in my view at least, one of the big differences also between MRV of NAMAs or mitigation actions taken place under the nationally determined contributions nowadays, and what we had in the clean development mechanism, where very accurate emissions accounting was required due to it being an offset mechanism. Just wanted to add this point. Then moving back with the next question to Sri Lanka, and this one is on the current status of the NAMA. Is financing already secured? Because it's not in the NAMA registry of the UNFCCC.
Yeah, so it's actually dependent also on the larger BRT infrastructure being developed. So we went back and asked this question. So there are plans initially of the BRT itself, and I think the funding is being secured for that. And I think once they have the funding available for the BRT itself, we are in parallel seeking international climate assistance for the additional component, which is the NAMA. So as discussed with UNDP as well, currently the government is institutionalizing the BRT infrastructure development, and I think UNDP is also approaching international climate finance institutions to fund the NAMA.
Okay, thank you very much for this additional information.
If you allow me,
yes, please.
Yeah, just to add a little to the question that's being posed, which is a very, very important question in terms of is that NAMA registered in the UNFCCC NAMA registry? and maybe for the listeners to encourage many of you to actually also take that point home, that the registry does not cover all NAMA that countries have in place. And we've been outreaching to many of the developing countries to actually bring and submit these NAMAs to be recorded in the registry. Currently, we're working even with South Africa that's looking at bringing up some NAMA that they're only looking for recognition, but means finance at the national level. So we encourage also listeners participating in the webinar to also send this message out there that the projects that have been implemented under these schemes, it will be useful to also get them recorded in the NAMA registry. With that.
Yeah, thank you, William, for this note. I think it's very, very true because, of course, for at least everyone working internationally on NAMAs in different countries, it's a very useful source to have the NAMA registry. And of course, as the more information is included, the more useful it'll become. So thanks for that. One more question we have on the BRT, and this one is that says that, and maybe even beyond this particular example, the mode share of buses is over 60% in Sri Lanka. Given this, can we expect further modal shift from private vehicles to public transport or not?
Yes, so alongside, if you see the use of private buses, we also observe that the owned private vehicles are also increasing. So yes, there is definitely an expectation of a larger modal shift because because of the lack of, I would say, a planned infrastructure and organization of these buses, which was the main problem. People are also shifting to their own private vehicles, and I also brought in the point on the three wheelers, which are also a mode of transport. But having said that, yes, the large point is that people are shifting to a lot of private vehicles as well. So definitely there is a need to increase the modal share, which is reducing, and the numbers that we've stated is a 2012 kind of statistics that we could see from the government figures. But certainly, if you go and see, there is a large share of private cars and private taxis as well, which needs to be shifted. And there are separate talks on looking at an urban rail infrastructure as well, an upgradation of the current infrastructure. But I'm not aware of what's happening in that direction right now.
Thank you very much, Manpreet, for this clarification. I would like, because we have now 15 minutes left, I would like to use the opportunity to also ask one question regarding the maintenance issue, just because I've heard it in other countries as a challenge of electric buses, that there's no maintenance structure in place as yet. And it seems to be sort of a chicken and egg problem. So I'd just like to know whether you've come across the same argument in Sri Lanka, and whether there's any work that you did in particular looking also at the issue of maintaining these buses.
Yeah, certainly, Urda. So if you see the main NAMA document, we have categorized capacity building and maintenance as as a separate categorization of funding that is required, and which is envisaged from an international donor, and being considered important within the entire financing of the NAMA. So we did feel that this is really important, and as you rightly said, it has been observed as a challenge wherever these are being implemented. So Sri Lanka is no different in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Then we have one more question that actually relates to international climate finance. And the question is, for international climate finance support, does it always require MRV and monitoring? If yes, how? So I don't know whom of you would like to take up this question.
Yeah, let me take this up. Yes, I mean in all of these different climate finance sources, most of them are looking at a strong MRV arrangement, because at the end of the day, we want to know what are whether these emission reductions which were positioned are real, measurable, and verifiable, and also the fact that because international funding through donors are going into the program, they ideally like, again, a very strong monitoring of activities and outputs to be associated with the project or the program. So certainly going from whether it is CDM, whether it is NAMAs, whether it is the GCF's new programs, we are seeing in almost all of these different instruments, MRV plays a very important role, and I think it is required as well.
Thank you very much, William. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, yes, I agree with Manpreet in terms of what he said, but certainly we are describing this as climate finance, and what makes it climate finance in this sense is that the program or the project is contributing, in this case, mitigation intervention that we are discussing, is contributing to emission reductions, and that would be the justification that anybody would make in terms of sourcing for the climate finance. So definitely having in place a robust MRV arrangement or system that allows you to track this particular indicator, how much emission reduction is accrued because of the intervention, is primary. And therefore you need to have a proper MRV arrangements in place. And I'm sure any financing instrument that you're looking at, if it's actually called climate financing, and whoever is disbursing that funding, for example, if you go to the GCF, that will be a requirement they would want to see over time how the impact of the project, which is emission reduction, in this case CO2 reductions, can be measured and tracked over time. So it's primary that you have a proper MRV system in place to monitor the project over time.
Thank you, William, for this addition. Just one more point on that particular question. On the second part of this question, how? Of course, the how depends on each of the financing institutions. Each one has their own requirements regarding the monitoring. However, I'd really like to stress the point that in a post-Paris world, after the Paris Agreement, well, all countries have their own mitigation targets. And as long as we do not talk about offsetting, such as the clean development mechanism or any other new mechanisms, market mechanisms that might come up, as long as we don't talk about offsetting, the reporting requirements are not as difficult as they were in the clean development mechanism, under which it was kind of hard for transport to actually succeed due to the different, many individual emitting sources in transport compared to, for instance, the industry sector. So as we've seen in this example for Sri Lanka, the CDM methodologies are very good and provide very good guidance and can be applied as in this particular case. And also, I would say the data requirements are still doable, because bus operators anyway, they collect a lot of data. So a lot of the data that is needed, especially when we talk about bus fleets, is quite readily available from the bus operators. At least this is the case when we have formal systems. Of course, in informal systems, it's a little more difficult. But I would like to really say that the CDM methodologies, even if it's not CDM, they often offer a very good basis and guidance to MRV, even if maybe some of the aspects such as leakage, assessing the leakage, which was always required under the clean development mechanism, is not necessarily required under other funding mechanisms, and therefore takes out some of the burden of additional data collection, which made MRV more difficult and more expensive, let's say, more time consuming as well. So I would really like to just underline what my other presenters have said, that yes, as if that's the argument that you're reducing emissions, you'll have to come up with a calculation of how much that is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not possible or very, very expensive and time consuming. And a lot of the methodologies are already there that can be used and adapted to your particular situation. With that said, and since we don't have any more questions coming in, I would like to close this webinar and use this opportunity to again thank our presenters, William and Manpreet. I think it was a very interesting webinar. Even I learned a few more things that I hadn't known before. Thank you also for everyone who listened in and who posed their questions. The questions part is actually at least as interesting as the presentations, because we learn a lot about the issues that are important for our audience, and we try to pick them up in the work that we do. So thank you everyone who was interested in our webinar, and thank you to the speakers, and we hope to see you again online with the next episode, which we're still planning, but as soon as we have set a date, we'll send it around through the usual channels. We always send it also via Climate L, so you'll find us with the next announcement anytime soon. And thanks again to everybody. Have a nice day.
Okay, so thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.